All right, we're back at it. So, with respect to your Marxism vocabulary exercise, one of the prompts down at the bottom of the worksheet I gave you asks you to provide an example of the way or the ways in which what Marx refers to as the superstructure manages to produce subjectivity. So you remember from Marxist theory that if you understand the labor theory of value, you understand how and why it is that what Marx refers to as a base, which is to say the sphere of production, which is structured in accordance with the social relations of production. All of this encompasses what we may call the economic structure of society. Gives rise to a superstructure over the course of time. So this sort of simple answer is that because the bourgeoisie is able to extract so much surplus value, which is to say profit or money, on the backs of the labor power of the proletariat, which according to Marx is the class that produces the majority of value or economic wealth in society. Right? They take that wealth, that surplus value that they earn off the backs of the labor power of the proletariat, and they parlay it or invest it in a superstructure. And through the course of time, that superstructure functions as a kind of insurance policy that manages to keep the social relations of production stable or intact, right? Which is to say, it manages to secure and maintain the uneven power dynamic between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that is necessary for the bourgeoisie to maintain their power over the proletariat. Okay? And so the superstructure, as I discussed in previous screencast video lectures, consists of a variety of things. There are social and political institutions. For instance, the state. It consists of the law or the legislative branch of the state. For example, here in the United States, that would be Congress, which is, say, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, that propose and debate and vote on and ultimately implement laws, right? Laws that ultimately, according to Marx, redounds to or accrues to the advantage of the ruling class or the bourgeoisie. So the superstructure does a number of different things, and it consists of a number of different things. As you can see from this PowerPoint slide, uh, it consists of the media. Here you have an image of riots that recently took place in Minneapolis, broadcast by CNN. Now, media shapes the narratives whereby society understands itself in ways that oftentimes, but not it's not always the case, but oftentimes work to secure the economic and political interests of those in power. Okay, we have advertisements here, a cigarette ad, a hamburger ad. We have a milk ad here, uh, all of which encode certain messages that are subtle and not so subtle about how to be in the world. What is it we ought to desire? So the superstructure uh, it has a way of influencing, shaping, determining subjectivity, consciousness. How is it we conceive of ourselves? How is it we conceive of others? Along the lines of, for instance, race, gender, class, what have you. And for Marx, the superstructure uh, manifests, it pumps out, it saturates our lives or the cultural atmosphere of our lives with certain ideological messages that are only in our waking everyday lives semi-conscious and oftentimes largely unconscious. Okay, so ideology is the air that we breathe, and it has a way of structuring and producing, determining subjectivity. So, to give you some examples, for instance, wide Sargasso Sea. I'll take, for example, the law. So, you may have noticed in wide Sargasso Sea that when Rochester marries Antoinette, that he is legally entitled to the money that she inherits from her stepfather, Mr. Mason. And so the law, which was debated and implemented by politicians, representatives in England in the early to mid 19th century, uh, states that a woman is not legally entitled to manage her own money. So that when she gets married, if she has assets, capital, money, all of those are legally speaking uh, uh, owned, as it were, by the husband, which is to say, the man. Now, what does that tell us uh, about the law, right? Well, first of all, this particular law assumes, or at least implies, that a woman should not be in a position whereby she has the agency, the power, the free will to decide how it is that she should spend her money, invest her money, what have you. Okay? So there's an idea that is hardwired into the DNA of that particular law that women are inferior to men, which is to say that women do not have the intellectual capacity, which is to say the capacities for clear, logical thinking, the capacities for reason to make responsible decisions with respect to matters of money. So the law, which is implemented by legislators who work for the state, it implies and it manifests what we in the 21st century might look back at the 19th century as a benighted and ignorant, a sexist law, right? That places a certain amount of uncritical faith in the truth value of the proposition that women are inferior to men because they suffer from a deficit of rationality, that they are more like animals in as much as they are enslaved to appetite, to instinct, to their emotions, and therefore uh, should not be in a position to make decisions on matters regarding money. That this is the sphere of men. And we can imagine that Antoinette in Why Is Her Gas So doesn't see the sense or the so-called truth value in what is implied by that particular law. But she's not in a particularly strong or advantageous position to be able to criticize that law. And if she does criticize that law, which is to say she criticizes patriarchy and men in positions of authority and power, like, for instance, her husband, Mr. Rochester, then she is vulnerable to being marginalized, silenced, trivialized, uh, even abused. We see in Why Sargasso is in the case, it is indeed the case that because she doesn't fit the model of a good patriarchal woman, if you will, that she is subject to the wrath and the ire and the injustice of her husband, Rochester's behavior. Think about women in early to mid 19th century England. Imagine what a woman, say for instance, in the upper class might think of that particular law, that women are not legally entitled to make informed decisions on how to manage, invest, spend money, what have you. Women didn't have access to a university education. Women didn't have the right to vote. And I can imagine, as I'm guessing you could imagine, that there are certain women who just assumed that what the law says about a woman's nature versus a man's nature is somehow reflective of the truth, which is to say that men are designed for certain activities, right? Uh, and are able to fulfill certain responsibilities, which is to say, going into business, right? Working in the sphere of politics. And there's also a sphere that uh, is naturally, as it were, the province of women. Having children, taking care of children, taking care of domestic matters, right? And that is just the truth of things. And that would be an instance, one particular instance, or an example of how it is that the superstructure, specifically this particular aspect of the superstructure, the law, mediates, shapes, and determines subjectivity, which is to say, the way that we conceive of ourselves, the way that we conceive of others, the way that we understand reality and the world for that matter. And there are many, 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 many other instances of this that we could talk about. Like, for instance, uh, the way that the law in 19th century society 19th century English society, before slavery was outlawed, right? How it is that this particular society and the superstructure, specifically the institution of the law, viewed black people, which is to say, not as full-fledged human beings, right? You can imagine how it is that that law shaped and determined and influenced the way that white people thought of themselves and others, and black people, and also the way that black people thought of themselves and others. Suffice to say, the superstructure, according to Marx, uh, has a powerful way of shaping the way that we think and conceive of ourselves. And also, it shapes the way we conceive of ourselves, right? In a way that has a profound tendency to reproduce and protect the political and economic interests of the bourgeoisie and to keep them in positions of power.